Hi. So this video lecture is going to try and cover two of the most important poets of the Victorian age. It is thundering outside, so if you hear thunder, that's on my end, not on yours, unless it's also thundering there. So the two poets that I want to try and talk about, or talk through in this video lecture, are Alfred Lord Tennyson and Matthew Arnold. So Tennyson was perhaps the archetypal Victorian poet. He was regarded as a great sort of genius of letters, and he actually became the poet laureate of Victorian Britain. He was regarded as a natural genius, but he probably actually wasn't. He was probably, a better description of him would probably be an autodidact, someone who had very carefully and thoroughly educated himself in terms of how to be a great poet. And then Matthew Arnold was famous for his poetry, but he was as famous, or more famous, for his social criticism, his criticisms on education, and his theory and things like this. So he was both a poet and a literary scholar and a social critic. Tennyson's sort of less interested in social criticism and things like this. But I've asked you guys to read 3 poems between these two poets. So from Tennyson, I asked you guys to read Ulysses and the Charge of the Light Brigade, and then from Matthew Arnold, I asked you guys to read Dover Beach. So I want to talk through some of the important components of these 3 poems in this video lecture. So Ulysses is grounded in ancient Greek and Roman literature. Probably the thing that we would sort of most recognize, most of us, would be Homer's The Odyssey, because Ulysses is the Roman name for the Greek Odysseus. So when Tennyson is writing about Ulysses, he's writing about Odysseus, and his son Telemachus gets mentioned in the poem as well. So this is what we call a dramatic monologue, and this is a form that the Victorians really excel at. They are very, very, very good at the dramatic monologue. So essentially, the dramatic monologue, what this is characterized as a genre, is that it is it's a poem in a voice distinctly different from the poet's own perspective, and it explores a different character's experience through their first-person recollections. So this is dramatic in the sense that it performs a character, in this case the character of Ulysses, the aging king of Ithaca in ancient Greece. So it performs this character, and it imagines what he would say. And this is a monologue in the sense that it is a singular voice speaking. Again, in this case, the voice of Ulysses. And so what Ulysses is reflecting on in this poem is the need for adventure, the need to go out and do something, and to sort of find his greatness again. Because, so he's sort of looking back from old age on his adventures chronicled in the Odyssey and things like this, and sort of saying, this being here in Ithaca, being the king, this is very dull, and this is not really what I'm meant to be doing. I'm meant to be out having great adventures, discovering new lands, and so on and so on. And I think there's a way of reading this poem that suggests affinities with the British Empire. That the British are not meant to just sort of stay at home, but they're meant to go out and build empire. They're meant to go out and pursue the horizon and things like this. And we get this notion toward the end. This would be lines 56 down through 61. Come, my friends, 'tis not too late tis not too late to seek a newer world. Push off, and sitting well in order, smite the sounding furrows. For my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. So we get, I think, this element of the British spirit during the Victorian age, this element of the Victorian spirit, and this desire to sort of go out and be great. In the Victorian sense, on behalf of the empire; in Ulysses' sense, in behalf of his own sort of glory and his own what the Greeks would call kudos, his sort of heroic worth. So the charge of the Light Brigade, sorry, I didn't actually tell you what page that was on in case you missed it. So Ulysses starts on 1170 and goes through 1172, sorry. The charge of the Light Brigade, the other Tennyson poem I asked you guys to read, starts on 1235 and goes through 1236. So this is a poem inspired by contemporary events from when it was written. It was written in 1854. And in 1854, the British entered what was known as the Crimean War, which pitted the British, French, and a number of allies against the Russians, principally. Like, it was actually sort of fought over some minor, nowhere bit of the Caucasus in southeastern Europe, sort of Middle East area. Nobody really needed it at the end of the day, but they had a war over it nonetheless. And there was a cavalry charge by a British cavalry regiment or brigade. It was basically a suicide mission, and it wasn't actually supposed to happen. It was a mistake in the orders, but they charged nonetheless against a group of Russian machine guns, and they were decimated. Like, they were just totally destroyed. It was one of the worst mistakes in military history. And so the story goes that Tennyson sort of read a newspaper report about this and then composed this poem as a sort of commemoration of this charge. And one of the things that I want to sort of point out about this from a literary perspective is the repetition, because Tennyson uses a ton of repetition in here. So lines 1 and 2 are half a league, half a league, half a league onward. So we've got the repetition there of half a league. Stanza 3 begins cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them. And then we get that repeated, actually. We get the first 5 lines of stanzas 3 and 5 pretty much the same. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell. Stanza 4 has flashed their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the gunners there. So we've got flashed repeated, we've got sabres repeated, and then saber gets repeated later on in that stanza at line 35. So what's the upshot of all this repetition? Well, part of what the repetition, and then we got sort of the repetition at the end of each stanza. Well, at the end of the first 3 stanzas is exactly the same. The line is rode the 600. And then the 4th, 5th, and 6th stanza, we have slight variations, but still this idea of the 600. Part of the reason that this repetition is so important is because it creates this sort of overwhelming sense of fatality. So we take these repetitions from lines 1 and 2, half a league, half a league, half a league onward. This draws the experience out. This is half a league, not as a fairly short distance, because half a league is not tremendously long. It's about 1.5 miles, which, I mean, is long, but it's not terribly long. But by repeating it 3 times, by drawing it out, drawing this idea out, Tennyson is giving us this sense of a great distance that's going to take a long time to cross. And then stanzas 3 and 5, the repetition of cannon. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them, is giving us a sense, again, of how overwhelming this task is, how suicidal this charge is, because we get the sense of cannon surrounding them. So the repetition here is about building the heroic quality of this charge by evoking how difficult it is, both in terms of covering distance, in terms of the enemy that they're engaging with, and so on and so on. And so, I mean, but this is a patriotic poem, ultimately, and I mean, Tennyson is glorifying their willing sacrifice for Britain. Matthew Arnold, on the other hand, in Dover Beach, pages 1387 to 1388, is less interested in glorifying contemporary Britain. Arnold is a very interesting figure, or this poem is a very interesting poem, because it actually almost prefigures modernism, which doesn't really sort of kick off until, some would say, the 1890s, and this poem was written probably around 1851. But really, modernism really kicks off during World War I. So around 1914, 1915, 16, so on and so on. Dover Beach anticipates a lot of the problems and concerns that will later go on to mark modernist literature. So there's this connection with the classical. So he talks at the beginning of the second stanza, lines 15 and 16, about Sophocles, the ancient Greek playwright. Sophocles long ago heard it on the Aegean, and it brought into his mind the turbid ebb and flow of human misery. We find also in the sound a thought, hearing it by this distant northern sea. So that's stanza 2. So we've got this sort of connection with the classical, which is something that the modernists love doing. And when we get to T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland in week 5, you'll see that really. But then we've got this sense of loss. We've got this sense that something has been eroded, something has been, something is in decline. And this is the third stanza, really. So lines 21 on through 28. The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind, down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. And this is a very sort of characteristic modernist move. So even though Arnold is writing this more than half a century before the modernist movement really picks up steam, there's this sense of loss, and this sense that something which had been constitutive of society and culture and stability and things like this is somehow lost. The sea of faith, as Arnold puts it. And so what you get in Arnold's poem, and indeed for many of the modernists, what you get is a sort of chaotic experience of the world without the sort of foundational principles of things like the church, things like political stability, things like cultural stability, clear cultural roots, and things like this. And this is the crisis of modernism that Matthew Arnold is anticipating half a century early. And indeed, a lot of his social criticism, one of his big ideas as a social critic, was the value of culture, not sort of inherently valuable in and of itself, but it was valuable because it provided stability for a civilization.